right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. We also offer the opportunity to take a single course without having to pay an entire semester's worth of tuition costs. One can also audit such a course at much less cost. If you are interested in learning more about us, please feel free to speak to one of our staff at the conclusion of this event. The speaker today is a guest lecturer for our new energy security course at IWP. This course is taught by Dr. Sarah Vakshori, so if you have any questions, please feel free to visit our website or you can speak with her directly after the lecture. Stephen D. Eule is a Vice President for Climate and Technology at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Global Energy Institute. With more than 2 decades of experience, Mr. Eule is a recognized and respected expert on the nexus between energy and climate change. He engages with business groups across the world, is asked frequently to testify before Congress, and is quoted often in major media outlets. Mr. Eule represents the Chamber in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and helped found the Major Economies Business Forum on Energy Security and Climate Change, a coalition of more than 20 national cross-sector business organizations from major economies. Mr. Eule also is responsible for GEI's 2 authoritative energy security reports, the Index of U.S. Energy Security Risk and the International Index of Energy Security Risk. Mr. Eule earned a Master of Arts degree in Geography from the George Washington University and a Bachelor of Science degree in Biology from Southern Connecticut State College. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at the Institute for World Politics. So let's just jump right into it. I'm going to talk to you today about the Energy Security Risk Index that we do at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. There are 2 indexes that we're going to talk about, and I hope to get through in time so that we have some give and take at the end of the presentation. If you can figure out how to work this, I guess it goes. Okay, so energy security has been a perennial political problem here in the United States, certainly since the late 60s and early 70s. I'm not going to read all these, but since Richard Nixon was president, energy security has been a perennial political problem. And it doesn't matter if Democratic or Republican, doesn't make a difference. Energy security has always been near the top of the political and policy agenda for presidents going back through Nixon. Energy security was like the weather back in those days. You know, everybody complained about it, but nobody did anything about it. So I'm going to show you how that's changed over the years. So what do we mean by energy security? Well, in Washington, D.C., energy security usually revolved around 3 metrics. What was the price of crude oil? And if you're a politician, what's the price of a gallon of gasoline? And another one is, are we energy independent? And I say, to have the bottom, energy independence does not necessarily mean energy security. They're 2 different concepts, but that does not stop policymakers in Washington from touting the benefits of energy independence. But from our perspective, it means a whole lot more than just those things. It's not just how much oil we import, it's who we're importing it from, how much do we pay, who gets the money, are the people who get the money friends of the United States or foes of the United States? How vulnerable are we to things like weather disruptions, geopolitical disruptions? How sustainable is our energy over the long term? So these are many facets of energy security that we've taken into account in our indexes. And the most important thing is it's more than about oil. Energy security is largely focused on oil for decades. From our perspective, it's more than about oil. Okay, so here's some of the dimensions of energy security. I'm not going to go into great detail on this slide, but what we did is we looked at what are the areas where energy security has most salience, and we came up with 4 of them. There are geopolitical risks, there are economic risks, there are liability risks, and increasingly there are environmental risks. So those are the 4 buckets that we kind of took a look at energy security in. And you can see some of the dimensions that we took a look at. So we asked the question, why an energy security risk index? We got started on this project. Because we're the Chamber of Commerce and we put out policy documents. And back in 2008, we did what we call the blueprint for energy. And one of the claims we're making in our blueprint was if you followed the policies that we laid out in this document, it's going to improve U.S. energy security. And then we started asking ourselves the question, well, how did we know that? And that led to some research into energy security and energy security measures. And what we found was that no one had created a measure for energy security. So we said, well, if no one has created one, maybe we should do one ourselves. And so that's what we did. I thought this was going to be a 3-4 month project when we started it. We wound up taking us a year and a half to do the first U.S. Energy Security Risk Index. And I started presenting the U.S. index. And one of the questions I would always get when I presented the U.S. index, well, that's great. The U.S. seems to be doing okay. How does it compare to the rest of the world? So we started thinking about that. He said, well, maybe you ought to do an international index. So I'll talk a little bit about the international index later on. The U.S. index provides 2 frames of reference, where we are compared to where we were back in 1970. And then we also use forecasts from the Energy Information Administration to project where our energy security might be going as far into the future as EIA looks. And then the international index provides that 3rd frame of reference. How does the U.S. compare to other large energy consuming countries? So one of the first things we had to do in developing our metric is to figure out what it is we were going to measure. And so here are some of the factors that we took a look at when we considered what metrics we would use. Sensible. The data have to be sensible and have to comport with common sense expectations. The data have to be credible. Most often that means that we used government data where government data were available. We've used some private sector data, we used some data from IEA, but most of the data that we use comes from the Energy Information Administration and other US government agencies. And that takes care of the next issue, transparency. We had to be transparent in what it is, the data we were using, they had to be readily accessible, and then we had to be clear on how we were manipulating the data and what it is we were doing with the data. Complete, we wanted the index to go back to 1970 if at all possible. And there's a lot of data that go back almost as far or nearly as far to 1970. Updatable, we wanted to do this every year, so we wanted to make sure that every year there were revisions to historical data and then new data for a data year. And then prospective, this gets into the forecasts, where possible we wanted to be able to use energy forecasts so that we could come up with a projection of energy security risks going forward. Sometimes the reality falls short of the ideal, but we never let the enemy be the perfect be the enemy of the good. There are a whole host of holes in the data, and we do our best to fill in those gaps where those gaps occur. And we're pretty clear about where those do occur, and that's part of the transparency. But we're not going to let the perfect be the enemy of good in this. And I think overall we've done a pretty good job of coming up with something that's certainly credible. All right. So, yeah. And by the way, do we want to ask questions at the end? If people want to ask questions during the presentation, that's okay with me. Okay with you? Yeah?
Yeah, at the end.
Okay. So for the U.S. index, we use 37 different metrics, and these are the 9 categories that we use. Is that going to work? No, that's not going to work. Okay. Global fuel metrics, those metrics measure the risks that attach to world supplies of crude oil, natural gas, and coal. Fuel import metrics, the security of our imports of oil and gas and how much we pay for imports of oil and gas. Energy expenditure metrics, these concern, and price and market volatility, these concern how much we pay, what the price is, what the volatility is. Energy intensity metrics and energy use metrics, these focus on energy efficiency by and large, by sector and also overall. Energy power sector metrics, we were able to get 3 of those, focusing mostly on reliability. Transportation sector metrics focus mostly on the supply of oil and other energy to the transportation sector, and also the efficiency of the transportation sector. Environmental metrics are almost they all focus around emissions of greenhouse gases, whether total emissions or emissions per unit of GDP or per capita. And finally, research and development metrics. This is supposed to get to the idea that over time, the energy systems in the United States get more sophisticated, the technologies get more sophisticated, and so good sort of leading indicator of where our energy security might be going is the amount that we invest in energy R&D. So we take those 37 different metrics and we combine them in different ways to come up with 4 sub-indexes. And these are the things that I mentioned earlier, the 4 buckets that we take a look at when we consider energy security. We come up with a geopolitical index, a sub-index, an economic sub-index, a reliability sub-index, an environmental sub-index. Many of the 37 metrics are included in more than one of the sub-indexes. They're weighted differently. Not all the metrics are in all of the sub-indexes. All right. Then we take our 4 sub-indexes. We weight them 30% geopolitical, 30% economic, 20% for environment and reliability, and we come up with one single number, the index of U.S. energy security risk. So that's kind of how we do it. There's a lot more, obviously, that goes in here. We weight them all a little bit differently, and we can talk about that later if you would like. But that's pretty much a rundown on how we arrive at the number. So here is the index. So a couple of things I want to tell you. When you do an index, you have to you measure metrics in values, and you have to convert those values to an index. And so one of the problems we had, or one of the issues we had was, okay, what is going to be our base year? And we decided on 1980 being the base year. A lot of bad stuff going on. Leading up to 1980 with the Arab oil embargo, you had the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, you had a couple of recessions in the United States, you obviously had the Iranian hostage crisis, the efficiency of the U.S. economy wasn't very good. There were a lot of risks that attended to oil. So I know there's a lot of bad stuff happened in 1980. And when you talk to people in the energy space and they think back to 1980, they shudder, right? So we said, okay, we're going to set our baseline as at 1980, and we're going to give 1980 a score of 100. So all our 37 metrics, when we convert them into an index, we give them a score of 100. And then everything revolves around that 100 score, and that's how we come up with the individual indexes for the 37 metrics, and that's how we come up with the score of 100 for 1980. So the second thing I want to tell you, this is like the golf score, all right? We're measuring risk here, so high is bad, low is good, yeah? So anytime your risk score approaches 100, bad things are happening or potentially could happen, yeah? And anytime your risk score is well below 100, things are going pretty well, all right? So this is what it looks like going back from 1970 to out to 2040, and I will click here and show you a few things that have happened. And when we started doing this, we had no idea what this was going to look like, but it's funny, sort of the peaks and valleys kind of correspond with the way we think about our energy security, at least the way my consultant and I thought about it. You have the Arab oil embargo in the early 70s and see increasing risk all the way up to the Iranian hostage crisis. Then after 1980, you see a pretty large decline in risk of about 25 points from 1980 through the mid-1990s. Now, I showed you earlier all those quotes from presidents, yeah? I had a heck of a time finding a quote on energy security from Bill Clinton. And if you look at the Energy Security Risk Index, Bill Clinton's administration, he had some of the lowest scores on the record of the index. So that kind of explains why we had a very difficult time finding a quote from him on energy security, because energy security wasn't a big deal. And our chart, our index actually shows that. So from the Iranian hostage crisis to the mid-1990s, you have greater U.S. output, you had the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System coming into play, which delivered a lot of Alaskan oil to world markets. You had North Sea oil increasing production at that time. the U.S. economy got a lot more efficient. Back during the Arab oil embargo, we were getting about 12% of our electricity from oil. And so people were getting hit not only every time they fill up the gas tank, but every time they paid their utilities. So we started seeing a switch from oil to a little bit to natural gas, but more to coal and nuclear during the 1980s. We also saw the Saudis drive the price of oil down in the late 80s, early 90s. So we see a lot of things happening over this period that resulted in a very low risk, record low risk actually in the mid-1990s. And then from the mid-1990s, 2000, we start seeing risks increase. We see increases in the price of natural gas and the price of crude oil. And we hit a high risk in 2011. I think it was 101 points. And since then, we've seen about a 25-point drop in risks between 2011 and our most recent number, which is 2018. And I'm going to ask the question, a lot of people get this, the reason for that drop, can anybody?
Gas, natural gas.
Close, yeah. Hydraulic fracturing.
Shale,
Yeah, shale. That's the shale revolution right there. What I tell people is that when you look at 1970 to 1980, that was about a 25-point increase over 10 years. That was very, very fast. I'm sorry? No, I'm talking about this. Right? So that was an increase in 25 points. And then in fewer years, we saw a decrease from 2011 to 2018 of about 25 points, which means that as far as U.S. energy security risks are concerned, the shale revolution was as consequential as all the bad stuff that happened in the 1970s, leading up to 1980. I mean, that's how impactful the shale revolution has been. Because when we think about all the bad stuff that happened in the 1970s, the fact that the shale revolution compares to that, to the good, is I think, testament to how dramatically that the shale revolution has affected U.S. energy. And then the forecasts period, it's very, very low. We're looking at forecasts now that are below the record low from the mid-1990s. So the future looks pretty bright when it comes to U.S. energy security. And I think, one thing I like to do, and my contractor liked it, we both think this is a great way to analyze things, is to look at what your view of the future was a few years ago compared to what your view of the future is today. And so what we did was we went back and looked at the forecast from the Energy Information Administration, and we plugged our model into it. And we looked at what we thought our energy security risk might be out to 2030 to 2040. And the blue line at the top, so this blue line at the top is the first year that we did it, and we were expecting that we would get risk scores between 95 and 100 all the way out to 2030. So that was in 2010. That was right at the very beginning of the shale revolution. And then you see the big black dotted line, that's the most recent forecast that we have. You can see because of the shale revolution now, our risks going out to 2040 are considerably lower than they were just 10 years ago. And again, that's due to the application of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling and advanced seismic imaging that led to the shale revolution. Okay. And these are some key metrics in the index that we take a look at. The metrics that have moved most over the years. At the top, you have crude oil production, natural gas production. So these, the red lines are the forecasts that were made in the annual energy outlook in 2010. The blue line is the forecast from the most recent annual energy outlook. And you can see huge differences in our view of the future. Right? So where we thought we might be producing anywhere from 5.5 to 6 million barrels of oil a day, crude oil a day, we're now talking about 14 to 15 million barrels a day of crude oil, all the way out to 2050. Nobody imagined this back in 2010. Same thing with natural gas production. Natural gas production from about 2020 on out will increase every year. Every year out to 2050, we're expected to hit a new record in natural gas production. And obviously that's going to have a big impact on our net crude oil imports. We see that the AEO, the blue line again, our net crude oil imports are down to about 3 million barrels a day out to 2050. And net natural gas imports, we are now a net natural gas importer, have been for the past year and a half. So these, the metrics that are connected to these crude oil production, natural gas production imports, weigh very heavily into the index, and so this explains why we've seen such a dramatic drop in our risk scores. So we are going to see some risks hit zero. We don't measure negative risks in the index, and these are not risk index scores. These are the actual metrics. So we have U.S. natural gas imports. We're now a net exporter. U.S. net petroleum imports, we include, in the import figure, we include product. So within the next couple of years, we are going to be a net exporter, according to the EIA. We're going to be a net exporter of U.S. petroleum. And that means our U.S. oil and gas expenditures and our oil and gas expenditures as a share of GDP are also going to go negative in the next couple of years, which means that we're going to have 4 very significant metrics in our index that are going to have risk scores of zeros. I got to tell you, when we started doing this, we never anticipated that we would ever see anything like this. We anticipated that for years and years and years, our story and our index is going to be of increasing risk. And hasn't been. And that's all because of the shale revolution, once again. And I always put this slide on. I always have to apologize for it because I said that, energy independence is not the same as energy security, but people are very interested in energy independence, especially the occupant of the White House. So this is just net energy imports as a share of U.S. Energy demand. And what's interesting, this chart starts in 1949, and we produced about the same amount of energy in 1950 that we consumed. And you can see over the years, by the time we hit about 2008, 2009, we were importing about 30% of the total amount of energy that we consumed. And that little red line is the forecast from the AEO 2010. EIA anticipated that we would still be importing anywhere from 20 to 25% of our energy out into the future. But you can see what's happened. We now expect that within the next year or two, the U.S. will actually be exporting more energy than it imports. Okay, so Shales Everywhere. So why was the U.S. number one? Number of reasons for this. Technology was developed here. We have the infrastructure here. We have an entrepreneurial economy here. But probably the biggest thing is that in the United States, if you own the land, you own the mineral rights under that land. It's almost unique in the world. And, when I think about President Obama's legacy, he wanted to be known as the green energy president. And you can make a case that he was a green energy president. But he also provided over the revitalization of the oil and gas industry in the United States. And I'm convinced the reason it happened on his watch is because almost all the increase in production from shale formations has come from private land, private and state land. And the reason is because people got a check in the end of the month. They don't mind the noise, they don't mind the dirt, they don't mind the lights, they don't mind the traffic, because at the end of the month, they get something from the producer. The states and local governments love it because they get some royalty money from this. And this is, when I talk with people overseas, that is the big stumbling block, well, one of the big stumbling blocks. We're developing shale formations over years, overseas is, how do you get local communities to get any benefit from the shale resource? And it's a big conundrum. And a lot of folks are thinking long and hard about how do you get the local community to buy into developing their shale or letting companies develop the shale formations in their area. They don't see any benefit. So I think that's one of the big stumbling blocks. I think that's something a lot of countries are working on, and we'll see how successful that they're going to be. All right, I also mentioned energy efficiency earlier. We do have a number of metrics. There's no surprise here. Since our metrics began, we're seeing great improvement in energy efficiency, depending on how you measure it. Where we're not seeing so much really is in U.S. household energy efficiency. Our houses are becoming much more energy efficient, but they're also becoming bigger, all right? And we have more household gadgets that run on electricity. So they're becoming more energy intensive in many respects. But our industrial energy efficiency, commercial energy efficiency are doing quite well. And the importance of this is that these things don't move very fast. There's some metrics in our index that can move quite rapidly, crude oil price volatility, for example. But these things move very slowly, but at the same time, they are able to moderate risks over the longer term. So we do some sensitivity analysis, and it's amazing how much energy efficiency has improved. Yeah, how much energy efficiency has improved our risk scores compared to 1970 to 1980. So this is a big moderating factor that we can't overlook. They're not sexy. They don't move fast. We don't report a lot of them in our reports because they don't move fast. But I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that these are incredibly important in moderating risks. Okay. We do have a lot of metrics that focus on emissions of carbon dioxide. And a lot of that's in the power sector. This is another area where obviously where the shale revolution has had a big impact. We're seeing a lot of substitution of coal for natural gas in the power sector. And are you all familiar with the Kaya identity? So these are the 4 factors that contribute to emissions, either carbon emissions from energy, either increasing or decreasing. And they are GDP, population growth, electricity intensity. If you're doing the economy-wide, you would look at energy intensity, but electricity intensity, how much electricity it takes to produce $1 of GDP, and then CO2 intensity of generation, how much CO2 do you emit per megawatt hour. And so you see that in the red bar is GDP, blue is population. Those are above zero, so they put upward pressure on CO2 emissions. And the green and the purple are below the zero. They've been putting downward pressure on CO2 emissions since 1970. And I just want to draw your attention to the purple, how long those bars have gotten over the past 6, 7, 8 years. That's all because of the shale revolution and the substitution of coal, of natural gas for coal. And the black dotted line just shows you that beginning around 2007, 2008, you've seen a dramatic decline in CO2 emissions from the power sector. Again, this lowers our risk. And again, nobody anticipated this, 10 years ago. But this is what's happening. Okay, affordable energy is also a competitive advantage. I show slides like this to my colleagues in Europe. They always break out into cold sweat when they see it. So these are the prices for electricity for industry, price of natural gas for industry, and price of steam coal for industry in the US and other OECD countries. I've highlighted the US price in red so that you can see in just about every case, the U.S., well, in all cases, the U.S. is either between the first, second, or third cheapest. This is a huge competitive advantage. The president has made this a priority, keeping this advantage. It's central to his plans to revitalize U.S. manufacturing. It gives the U.S. a huge competitive advantage. And it's one of the benefits of not only the shale revolution, but energy security in general. Okay, so what are some new risks? One of the questions I always get asked is, you do anything, do you measure rare earths and those sort of things? We haven't measured rare earths, but we're considering it because we weren't quite sure that the data were robust enough for us to do that. But since over the last year or so, we've kind of taken a deep dive into some of the data in four what we call critical earth elements, cobalt, graphite, lithium, and rare earths. These are all materials that are used not just in information technologies, but also used in energy technologies as well. And so, and they've also become a big concern to the administration, and this is why. What we do with a lot of our metrics, but what I did here was we take Freedom House scores, right? So Freedom House measures political and civil liberties. And we take those scores, and what we do, in this case, what we've done is weight world production of these four materials using the Freedom House scores. Freedom House also categorizes countries into free, partly free, and not free countries. So that's what I've done here. But I've also added China in. China is the sort of light red here. So the free countries are the countries in green, yellow, partly free countries, red, not free countries, and sort of light red, China, for these elements. So if you look at world graphite production and rare earth production, two charts on the right-hand side, China dominates us. And if you look at the one on the upper left, that's world cobalt production. Even though China doesn't dominate cobalt production, other bad actors do. And today, about 80% of global production in cobalt is coming from countries that Freedom House categorizes as not free. For graphite, it's about 75%, and it's about 80% for rare earths. Lithium, yes, sir.
Are you mixing production with refining?
No, this is mine production.
That's actual production of
Right.
the mine, not
Right.
refining.
Right. And I understand refining is an issue too, but we haven't delved into that yet. So right now we're just looking at production. And even in lithium, where it looks pretty good, I mean, China dominates about that. China accounts for about 10% of the market in production as well. Yeah, so we understand what refining and reserves. This is just one shot, just to sort of demonstrate that this is an issue. And this kind of graphically shows. So, to make a long story short, we are looking into this. One of the issues that we have are: can we trust the data? Will the data be forthcoming? How would we weight these? So when you weight when you weight the metrics in your index, the weightings have to add up to 100. So that means we add some metrics on critical earth elements, and we have to figure out what do we take from. And then there's also a question of how do you phase these in? Nobody cared about these things in 1970, but people care about it today. So would it be fair for us to give it the same weight in the 1970s we do today? We don't think so, but we're not quite sure what that weighting should be. So look out for the U.S. index, which will be coming out probably within the next month. We have some information. I have a whole section on this, and we're asking people to give some ideas on how they think we should be treating these critical earth elements in upcoming indexes. So that's going to be a change that we will see. Okay, so the international index. It's a little bit different than the U.S. index. We live in a very data-rich environment here in the United States. You get outside the United States, you don't have quite as much data. So we use 29 metrics. We don't have, we have the same metric groups except for research and development. We started in 1980, and we focus on the largest 25 energy-consuming countries, sort of. We have a couple of exceptions. We don't have a forecast component. And we established an OECD baseline for comparison. And that's 1980 equals 1,000. We chose 1,000 because we didn't want to confuse this with the U.S. index, which is 100. Because the U.S. numbers are different. They have to be different because we're using 29 metrics instead of 37 metrics. So then these are some compromises that you have to make when you do this sort of thing. So total risk scores for 2016. The U.S. is number 2. Yay. Norway is number 1, and at the bottom of the list is Ukraine. We have data from Ukraine starting in 1992. It's been number 25 since 1992. It probably will remain number 25 for dozens of years. It's got a lot of problems. But it's a pretty, I don't think it's a surprising list. One of the countries that a lot of people are surprised at the ranking is Russia, because they figure with all the resources that Russia had, it should be ranked higher. Russia has a tremendous amount of resources, but again, it's not just about energy resources, it's how efficiently you use those resources. And so Russia scores very well when it comes to our energy import metrics and those sorts of things. It scores very poorly on environmental metrics, very poorly on energy efficiency metrics. So while it has some distinct advantages, it also has a number of problems as well. So I think I'll skip this. Won't go too much into detail on this and just talk a little bit about, so this is kind of our spaghetti chart of the historical rankings. You can see Ukraine here. We had to actually inset it because otherwise we'd make the chart a little, yeah. So here's the US in red, and the big heavy black line is the OECD average. So you can see this US score was above the OECD average for a number of years, and then starting around 2009 or so, our risk scores moved below the OECD average. I'll show you this in more detail in a minute. So here's our rankings. So there are two things here. There's the ranking and the risk score. So since about 1980, the U.S. Was ranked anywhere from about 8 to 11, kind of chugging along, and then you can see the impact of the shale revolution. We started climbing the rankings, and in our most recent edition, 2016, we achieved a ranking of 2. Actually, in 2015, we achieved 2. We do this index every 2 years. We're in the middle of doing this now, and I can't share with you the data on where we rank today because I haven't seen it yet, but my contractor has. So anyway, that'll also be coming out over the next few months. But the point here is you can see the impact of the shale revolution on the U.S. and how it compares to other countries. So one of the things we do as an analytical tool, we compare how the U.S. or every country, how its risk scores compare to OECD. And this is essentially, the OECD is the average is the red line, and the blue line represents the percent difference between whatever country you're looking at and the OECD average. So you can see here the U.S. since 1980 chugging along nicely. It's pretty much the same story as the previous chart, except the line is moving in a different direction. And then around 2005 or so, you see a tremendous drop in risk score vis-a-vis the OECD average. And so today we're about 10% below the OECD average, which is actually quite good. If you saw Mexico, for example, I don't have the chart here, but Mexico from 1980 was about 30% below the OECD average, but it's been creeping up and up and up and up and up and up. Mexico actually scores very well in our index. It's number 4, scores very well on our index, but if you look historically, you will see that I'm sorry, when you look at comparatively against the OECD average, you can see that Mexico, even though it scores very well, is losing ground. So it's moving in the wrong direction. And I think the constitutional reforms are kind of a reflection of their recognition that they were moving in the wrong direction. So this is just one chart that shows you different types of energy security challenges. I'm not going to go into any great detail on this chart, but what I did here was put in the total scores for the different groups, the subgroups that I mentioned, environmental, transportation, imports, and everything. I just want to show you something real quickly. Is that you can see I did Australia, Canada, and US, average those together. The red at the bottom, those are that's the average score for those countries for imports. You can see that imports contribute a very, very small amount of risk to the total risk score for those countries. And then look at Western Europe. they got a big import problem in Western Europe. And then when you look at down on the bottom left, the developing countries, they have a pretty big contribution from fuel imports, but the key thing is it's growing. And you see that a lot in this, is that risks, energy security risks seem to grow as developing countries move into middle income. And then they start to go down after that. Yes, sir.
It's hard to see the
Yeah.
charts exactly, but these are risk scores, right, that are going down in the later years in all cases. That's what it appears to be.
Yes.
Right? But the U.S. stayed steady over that same period.
No, it went down. Yeah.
Well, the future seemed to be fairly straight.
Oh, well, this is not the future. This ends in 2016. Yeah. Okay. So here are some takeaways from both the U.S. and the international index. Is energy security risks are all linked. Energy security improvements anywhere improve energy security everywhere, and the reverse of that is true. Disruptions anywhere can affect energy security and consumers everywhere. If you have a large resource base and you're a very efficient economy, you tend to score very well. Two examples are Norway and the United Kingdom. Both have large resource base, both pretty efficient economies. Large resource base plus inefficiency, you don't score very well. And again, Russia is the perfect example of that. Energy security is affected by factors over which countries sometimes don't have any control. I mean, Canada is a cold climate. And when you look at Canada's energy intensity scores, they're not very good. And one of the reasons they're not good is because they have to use a lot of energy for space heating. It's a big country. They use a lot of energy transportation to get from point A to point B. It's also a country that has a lot of mining and extracting industries, which also use a lot of energy. So, I mean, geography and climate could have a big impact on how you score in that. And quite frankly, that's no fault. The whole idea about the index is not to assign blame or fault countries, but it's sometimes just to say, this is the way it is. And so maybe from Canada's perspective, they might focus less on energy efficiency and more other things that they have greater control over, or they might redouble their efforts to attack energy efficiency. Resources aren't enough without a proper investment environment. I mentioned Mexico before. I'm convinced that the Mexicans were looking north of the border, seeing what was going on with the shale revolution, and said, we got to get in here. And the only way to do that is to reform the Constitution. So they did. So I'm expecting that we'll see. Mexican oil production, for example, has been declining for like the last 25 years. I think we'll probably see Mexico's production increase because of foreign investment. Same sort of thing has been happening in Indonesia. It's not a great place for investment, Indonesia, and I think the Indonesians are beginning to recognize that. But Indonesia has a tremendous amount of resources, but its risks vis-a-vis the OECD are moving in the same directions as Mexico's. It's getting worse compared to the OECD average rather than better, and that's not a good sign for them. Strong economic growth in emerging economies has exposed underlying weaknesses in energy security. We've seen this a lot with countries like India, China, even Mexico. As countries develop, they start using more energy. Initially, when countries develop, what we found, not in every case, but they tend to use energy less efficiently early on. And then as they develop and become more technologically sophisticated, they start using energy more efficiently. Same thing in the transportation sector. What we find is that a lot of countries, as they develop a strong middle class, people start buying cars, they start using oil, so oil import risks and oil risks in general start to increase. So what we do see is, though, that a lot of these developing countries and emerging economies are looking at energy security as a strategic priority for them. Certainly the Chinese are. And new technology can be a disruptive force. The perfect example of that is the U.S. hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, and advanced seismic imaging equals an energy revolution here in the United States. And so this is my last slide. So what we do when we do the international index, we publish some detailed data for the top 25 energy consuming countries in the world. And we also publish data for the next 50 countries, not in any great detail, but we run a model for everybody. And so when you run the model for everybody, this is the list that you get, the ranking that you get for the top 10 countries in the world. And this is a pretty eclectic list. You got Norway on there, you got Gabon, Chad, North Korea, United States, Burma, Denmark. So can anybody explain why countries like Chad and North Korea are on this list?
They import a lot of oil or energy resources.
They don't use one.
Bingo. I looked at this for a while and I said, I can't figure this out. I said, your energy security risks are pretty darn low if you're not using any energy, right? And that's really the tail of this chart, is that there are trade-offs. I'm sure Chad would love to trade off with some country that has a much higher energy security risk than it has, right? So while energy security is something that, it's been my business now for the last 10 years, but it's something that we want to pursue, we also have to recognize that using energy and accepting risks is part and parcel of growing. And this list, I think, shows that. So I think that's all I have. Yeah, that's who we are. So I'll be happy to address any questions that you may have. Yes, sir.
So you talked about energy efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
mitigating risk. I'm surprised you didn't mention renewables at all. Do renewables mitigate risk? And if they do, did you see that reflected?
So renewables would get reflected in a couple of things. And I didn't go into any great detail on these, but certainly our metrics measuring carbon dioxide emissions. So the more renewables you use, the less you emit, the lower your risk goes. Now, granted, the more renewables you use, your price of electricity might go up, and electricity is a metric in our index, the price of electricity. So, it could be kind of a mixed bag for renewables, depending on what the price is. We also have some diversity metrics in the power sector. So, to the extent that you increase the capacity of renewables in the grid, that's going to lower your risk too, because there's more diversity. So we don't measure renewables, and we also have a metric on zero emitting electricity sources. So we don't have a renewable metric or renewable metric specifically. The deployment of renewables does have an impact on a lot of the metrics that we do have. And one more example is in the transportation sector, we have a metric on the share of transportation energy that comes from oil. So obviously the higher that is, the higher your risk. There's a number of ways that you can reduce that. EVs is one, and another one is the use of biofuels. So again, we don't measure renewables specifically, but we do have a whole bunch of metrics in there that benefit from that they get lower when more renewables are deployed. Okay,
Given the recent events in Saudi Arabia, the drone strike on Cape,
mm-hmm.
do you believe that it has affected their ranking on the risk index?
We don't put Saudi Arabia in the risk index. They were actually one of the top 25 energy 25 energy consuming countries, but they're kind of a unique case. They don't score as well, but I do look at the numbers. They don't score as well as you would expect anyway, because kind of like Russia, they don't use energy all that efficiently. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yep.
That this was mostly your index is consuming, like from
We focus on
security of
energy
supply
consuming
rather
countries,
than
right?
Producers.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just to answer your question about renewables, I suspect that Denmark, because of its hydro, gets its low score because of the renewables in Denmark. So I suspect that's a reflection there.
I just put it's a good point. It's an excellent point. And Norway gets about 90% of its electricity from hydro,
Right.
which in our index isn't necessarily a good thing,
Sure.
because it's not a diverse supply. So helps Norway when we look at the environmental metrics, right, emissions and those sorts of things. Cheap energy prices helps there, but when we look at the diversity of the power sector, they don't score very well on that metric at all. So all these metrics interact in different ways, and that's an example.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm dealing with scenarios of shale bankruptcies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily see that reflected in your forecast.
It's not going to be. I mean, we have to use the data that are available to us. Here's one thing about not just this, but a lot of things. Like I said, we never put rare earths and critical earth elements in here because we didn't have the data. People have asked us, you really need a water metric. You know, we probably do need a water metric. It'd be great to have a water metric, but we can't figure out a way to create a water metric given the data that we have. And the same thing with I think what Trump would be very difficult for us to come up with a metric that would get to that.
Yes, but we now know that shale has a life of about 18 months in production.
Right.
So that is a metric.
So to the extent that that gets reflected in EIA's forecasts, yes. So I mentioned that we use the EIA forecast. We also, in each report, run the risk scores for each side case. So EIA has a side case on called a high oil and gas case, high resource case, and they also have a low resource case. So when we issue the report, you can go in and take a look at the risk scores, the future risk scores for each of the different side cases that the EIA does. And you know, like I said, to the extent the EIA incorporates that to its forecast, that would get picked up in our risk scores.
So this is the second half of our class, and on the first half there were some discussions and some questions were raised among the students about the forecast, and I just want to give the opportunity to students to raise their questions.
Yeah, I just had a question. So in a lot of your forecast examples around the graphs, they were all pretty stable for the next, 10, 20, 30
Oh, yeah.
years. Is there, something that you would consider putting there to change that forecast, or is it worth having that in there if it looks like it's going to be stable? Or
Yeah, no, it's a.
I mean, I know you can't predict the future.
It's a great point. It's a great point. And anybody who's taking a look at EIA forecasts of the price of crude oil, it's like that. And then when you see the price of crude oil in actuality, it's like that. I don't think there's any way to get around that. As a matter of fact, we compound things, and because we have 39 metrics, and not all of those metrics EIA measures in its forecast. So what we do is we just take a neutral stance, and we say whatever the last score is, historical score, we just run it straight out. And we just say that's not going to be a factor in the future. But we tell everybody how we do this. So if you come up with a different forecast, you can plug your numbers in and see how it would affect it. But yeah, I mean, that's something that we recognize. It'd probably take too many resources for us to be able to come up with something.
I think they were discussing that, like, for instance, going, what gentlemen discussed, not maybe a shale bankruptcy, but like, let's say because of environmental issues or change of policy, change of president, maybe we have changes in the production levels, and then how that would change for future. And do you want to ask your question about that?
Yes, well, one of my questions was answered, because I was thinking when the index was zero risk at certain points, and I thought, how could you have zero risk? But then I see from your data, even if you lost like half the production of natural gas for natural man-made, you would still have a lot, right? So is that where how do you have zero risk? So
zero, let's see, whoops.
It was in the report.
Like, how could it be a zero?
I mean, this
is what shows me that even if you have so much production that even if you had half of the production, it would still be below, right? It would still be.
Yeah, so remember, this is the actual metric, this is not the index. So when we do the index goes to zero and it doesn't go below zero.
Yeah, but I'm saying it's like as far as risk goes, it seems like it'd be strange to have zero risk, like there would be no risk.
Well, so you could have zero risk for an individual metric. All that means is that individual metrics, you don't have a risk anymore. And when we do the risk, it's not just for the imports, it's not just about how much you import, it's also about the risk attached to the either barrel of oil or a cubic foot of natural gas that you would import. So there are two dimensions to these. But once you hit zero, once you become a net exporter,
And I guess that's
your import risk is gone.
And then my second question was for, do you provide information to insurance company, like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? Who is your customer, like for as far as this
You're
index?
all my customers.
Well, I know. But
We know that insurance companies take a look at this. We know the IEA takes a look at it because obviously it's their mandate, energy security. Yeah, so I go through the list. We have Google Analytics. You can see who looks at our stuff, and it's amazing. We get everybody, all kinds of folks looking at this. I think you had it right, and then we go to you. Right? I'm kind of having trouble keeping track.
So this may be accounted for in the geopolitics and economics factors, but for the international index, are the forecasts also incorporating, just because you didn't speak to this as much, are they also incorporating the possibility of future energy integration across borders, like international integration, as far as like moving towards interconnected electrical grids,
Right.
and that security factor? Because as that becomes more of a thing, if that becomes a thing, and then there's the whole monitoring across borders and the digital.
I hate to sound like a broken record, but this is something that if we could measure it, and we could figure out how to measure it, we had data that we could get every year to measure it, we would do it. But we just can't do it. I mean, to the extent that it impacts, imports of electricity and those sorts of things, we would pick that up. But it'd be very difficult for us to come up with a metric. We'd love to do it. I mean, I can think of off the top of my head 10 metrics I would love to have, and that's something we just can't do. It's Sarah.
Sure. So thank you for your talk. My question is related to the resource curse. I was wondering if the resource curse, as it regards certain African countries in terms of precious metals, Nigeria in terms of oil, some say Venezuela in terms of oil as well, if that's reflected in your report. If so, how? And then if you see any major changes in resource curse countries.
So to me, the resource curse is just a matter of what type of government you have. You have a dysfunctional authoritarian government, you have a higher risk of having a resource curse than if you have you live in a democratic republic. To be honest with you, if every country behaved like Norway and Canada, I wouldn't be up here talking about energy security risk, right? But they don't. So that's why we're talking about energy security risk. So when we measure things like the supply of oil in the world and supply of natural gas and coal, we use the Freedom House measure of political and civil liberties to come up with. We use those as a proxy for reliability. Yeah. So we measure two things. We measure this international supply of energy. We use the Freedom House scores as a proxy for reliability, and then we also use HHI, the Herschel-Herfindahl index, which is a measure of concentration. So those are the two things that we use to measure the risks attached to a barrel of crude oil or a ton of coal or cubic foot of natural gas. So to the extent that so I think the answer to your question is strictly no, we don't measure the resource curse, but we kind of get at it through the things that we do measure using the Freedom House scores as sort of a proxy for reliability. And it's also, a measure of what kind of government you live under. Yeah.
What about cybersecurity and war?
Another one we'd love to do. Choke points is certainly another one too, and we've tried to figure out a way to do choke points, and it's just very, very difficult to do. The effort required to do it would probably be more than we would be able to get out of it. We're pretty satisfied with what we have. We think it's a pretty good guide to how well these countries do. But yeah, we could always do better if we had more data. Yes, sir.
To what extent does industrial energy efficiency affect things?
Well, we have that as one of our metrics. So it affects things to the extent that it improves, and depends on, and I can't be honest with you, I can't recall what the weighting is. But you can see here, we had very, very poor industrial energy efficiency, and it's improved probably 3 or 4-fold since the 1970s. This is one of the bright lights in the energy efficiency. Commercial energy hasn't gone down as steeply as industrial, and then as I mentioned, household energy has kind of been going in reverse, but seems to be getting better, picked up in the last couple of years. But yeah, it's obviously a big factor, and it's probably contributes more to improving overall U.S. energy security than any other metrics we measure in energy use. Yeah, so it's a big factor. Yes, sir.
You seem like a pretty accessible person. To any country who doesn't make the top 35 list, you often heckled or contacted for someone who flies to be on the list?
No, we send them a nasty letter saying they have to do better.
No, I mean, it would appear to me it's a distinction to be on your list.
Yes.
To even make the list. So, maybe somebody who's number 45 right now would like to do something to get on your list, because, obviously.
So we only publish the top 25. We don't publish everybody. So, and that list could change over time. Right? And we actually publish data for the top 75, but we publish detailed data for the top 25. When we do our ranking, we just look at the top 25. But yeah, so we say these are the 25 largest energy consuming countries. I think our year, the 2010 or something like that. And so those countries aren't going to change. Some of them may fall off the list, while others will go on the list. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to keep them the way they are. But we get a lot of interest from a lot of governments. We want to take a look at this.
Do you know who the bottom ranked country is right now?
Well, it's probably Ukraine or something like that. Thailand does very poorly. And out of the top 75, I can't think off my head. It's probably Ukraine.
But out of your 35, the 10 and then the 25 after that. It's probably in your report, right? The international report.
We just do the top 25. Whoops. So we just do the top 25. So here's the list here. And this is, again, this is a mix of emerging economies, developing economies, and advanced economies here. But Thailand, South Korea. South Korea is the largest, or what used to be the largest LNG importer. They import a lot of energy. Oh, Japan. I didn't mention Japan. Japan was very interesting. Let's see if I can. I'll just explain it. So, yeah, which color is Japan?
Turquoise.
It's this one right here. Yeah. So Japan was down here, was chugging along, and it was actually doing quite well in the ranking. And then Fukushima came. And they started having to import a lot more energy. And as a result, they probably dropped 5 places over the span of a couple of years. You gotta understand, when you're dealing with 20 some odd metrics, 30 some odd metrics, getting things to move is very, very hard. And the fact that they fell so precipitously just over the course of a few years because of a nuclear accident just goes to show you how impactful that was in Japan. Yeah, so it's one of the interesting stories that our numbers kind of validate what everybody perceives to be the situation in each situation in Japan. Yes, sir. You had a follow-up, yeah?
I just had a quick follow-up.
Last question.
Oh, last question. And then, can we do 2?
Yes.
Okay. I want to make sure everybody gets a shot. Okay.
So you kind of mentioned something in your answer that I wanted to follow up with a little bit, and you said it was your opinion that if everybody behaved like Canada and Denmark, we wouldn't have a problem. So the opposite of that thesis would be you can have sort of a democracy, if a fragile, sort of unstable democracy, and then you add a bunch of oil or add a bunch of resources, that can actually cause the corruption. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, or what the cause of the resource curse is, if it's the type of government itself, or if it's the resource, and if it's a little bit of both.
I think it's the type of government. I mean, my experience, and I'm not an expert in the resource curse by any stretch of the imagination, but my experience is whatever nature can throw at us, mankind can throw at us the same plus 10, or times 10. Humans have a pretty good capacity for screwing things up. We also have a pretty good capacity for making things a lot better. But even when you look at things like famines over the years, when you look at the worst famines in history are not because of anything Mother Nature did. It's usually because of something governments did. And I think when you look at the resource curse, probably looking at the same sort of thing. Yes, sir.
So with the shale revolution, the increase of new risk is methane. Is there enough data to include methane in the environmental factor?
Yeah, that's a good question. And other people have raised the issue, and we haven't really taken a close look at that yet. We probably should, though. But you raise a good point, because one of the benefits, obviously, of switching from coal to natural gas is that you're emitting less CO2 when you burn the natural gas.
Right.
But others have said, well, once you start taking into account the methane that's emitted, yeah, that's an issue. There are other environmental metrics that we could use as well. But I think the metrics that we have with CO2 are kind of a good proxy for where we are. But that's certainly something that we probably should consider. So good suggestion.
Tell us just before we go, what happened in 2011 that again the U.S. risk increased?
A lot of that was that the price of oil was very, very high then. I think it was like $130 or something like that. Yeah. So you're probably not going to be surprised, but the most heavily weighted metric in our index is the price of crude oil because it contains just a lot of information, right? And a lot of information that you couldn't get otherwise. So we weight the price of crude oil pretty heavily, and when the price of crude oil is that high, that's obviously going to have a big impact. The price of natural gas is also very high at that point, and we were importing a lot of that, both crude oil and natural gas. So those were the two biggest factors. Oh, and actually crude oil volatility. Crude oil volatility is one of these risks that can move the needle. I mentioned that energy efficiency, things move very slowly, very gradually, but crude oil price volatility is something that can really have an almost immediate impact on the index, and that's one of the things we saw in 2011, and we saw it more recently in 2015 as well. And that was when the price of crude oil was going down, right? But it still was disruptive. So volatility is one of the things that can move the index a lot. Yeah. All right, I think I've satisfied all the questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.